Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, navigating the new normal presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society and technology, real estate and medicine, technology and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plowden. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, AFRMC, a 501c3 national American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission in this free public affairs program with a donation of any amount. Visit us, American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, online and donate at AFRMC.org. Join us on social media, on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. We depend on you, our audience's support, to help the hospital in Israel. So thank you if you can contribute any amount. Our host and moderator for Global Connections is Robert Siegel, former host of All Things Considered on National Public Radio for 31 years. Over the course of an hour each month, Global Connections features guests who Robert Siegel interviews as they explore important issues in our world. Today's Global Connections topic is Israel's upcoming election. Thank you to our very special guest, Dr. Robert Satloff of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, Aaron David Miller of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and David Horowitz, founding editor of the Times of Israel. And now, Global Connection with Robert Siegel.
Thanks, Josh. On November 1st, Israelis will hold their 5th election since 2019. The past 4 elections have failed to produce a stable coalition majority that can form a government capable of legislating and remaining in power for more than a matter of months. Will the 5th time be the charm? Will it mark the return to power of former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? And if so, what's at stake for Israel and for Israeli relations with the U.S.? Big questions, and we have an excellent panel on hand to try to answer them. And you can pose questions to our panelists by using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Our first panelist joins us from Israel. David Horowitz was the founding editor of the Times of Israel. Before that, he was an editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and the Jerusalem Report. The Times of Israel is an English-language news website, and David Horowitz is British-born. He's been covering Israel since he emigrated from Britain almost 40 years ago. David, it's good to talk with you once again.
Good to see you again, Robert. Hi.
And before we talk about what's at stake in the election, it falls to you to explain, or if that's too high a bar, describe at least the Israeli electoral system and how 120 members get elected to the parliament, the Knesset.
Okay. I mean, how much time do you have? It's very, very democratic. In other words, in contrast to yours and the place where I was born, Britain, you feel in almost every circumstance that every vote counts. It's pure proportional representation nationwide with a 3.25% threshold. So if your party clears that threshold, which is tended to be around 130,000 votes or so. So if you get that many votes nationwide, you get your share of those 120 Knesset seats. And as you can imagine, with that system and that threshold, you have many, many parties getting into parliament. And in the entire modern history of Israel, there has never been single party government. There's always been coalition government, which is a very difficult way to govern and is one of the reasons, although it's not really the heart of our current dysfunction, but it's one of the reasons for our electoral problems. We had a coalition that took power early last summer. It involved 8 parties. So you're the prime minister. In that case, it was Naftali Bennett. His own party was only 7 strong. and yet he was trying to govern. He had a majority of, well, basically one at the best, 61-59 some of the time, and it couldn't hold. It was just an impossible, unwieldy, ideologically diverse coalition, united only in their opposition to Netanyahu. And so here we are back in election mode again.
Yes, and just to clarify, parties run national lists. There are no districts, as there would be in the United States or Britain, for that matter. You don't vote for an individual candidate, although your favorite, the person you might want to see prime minister, would be number one on some party list, probably. But the number, if you poll roughly 10% of the votes cast, you get about roughly 10% of the 120 seats in the Knesset. Fair enough?
Absolutely, exactly.
So, as you say, the last election produced this extraordinary coalition, which included people from left, from right, an Arab religious party, I believe, and what they were united about was Netanyahu. They were anti-Netanyahu. Is that what Israel is so deeply divided about, simply whether Bibi Netanyahu should become prime minister again? And what is his situation right now?
I'd say there are two divides, and you have to understand both of them, otherwise the problems we're having don't make sense. So there's a division, a right-left division, which in Israel, it does relate to socioeconomic issues, but it's broadly speaking more fundamentally about relations with the Arab world, and especially with the Palestinians. The more ready to compromise, trusting, ready to relinquish territory, the more you tend to the left. The more skeptical about the prospects of peacemaking, unwillingness to relinquish territory, the more you trend to the right. Now, on that division, there's a clear majority. The right in Israel is in the ascendant. It has been since, well, often, most of the time, for coming on to, well, about almost 50 years now, since 1977, when the right wing first came to power under Menachem Begin. They've held power most of the time. And at the moment, in that outgoing parliament of 120, more than 70 of the Knesset members are people of the right, of the ideological right. And therefore, that begs the question, well, then why is there any issue? Why isn't there a straightforward right-wing coalition in Israel, etc.? Because there's this other divide that you mentioned, and it's the pro and anti-Netanyahu divide. And in the outgoing coalition, in the coalition that collapsed and therefore triggered these elections, three of the party leaders would emphatically consider themselves men of the right. All three of them had served in very senior roles in Netanyahu governments, as ministers in Netanyahu governments. Naftali Bennett, Gideon Sa'ar, and Avigdor Lieberman. And all three of them declared that for them, despite their ideological affinity or affiliation or closeness to Netanyahu's worldview, they considered keeping Netanyahu out of power to be a more urgent imperative. And therefore, you had this bizarre, unprecedented coalition, as you said, spanning all the way from quite far on the right, across the center, into the left, and including, for the first time in Israeli history, as an essential component of a majority, a four-strong Arab party, conservative Arab party, unified really only over that single desire, successful for a year, to keep Netanyahu out of power. And why is that? Because Netanyahu perceived abroad or perceived in Israel as well, as a world-class statesperson, as incredibly articulate and effective articulator of Israel's challenges, incredibly experienced, well-connected, nonetheless very divisive within Israel, also on trial in very, very complicated graft allegations, 3 cases against him. It's been going on for a long time. Gideon Sa'ar, a former cabinet secretary, senior minister under Netanyahu, was saying ahead of the last elections, the most important thing for Israel is to keep Netanyahu away, because he has been power has not sat well with him. This many years in power. Netanyahu, remember, had been in power for 12 years, and an earlier 3 years in the 90s before he lost power last year.
Let's focus on Netanyahu's problems, his judicial problems first, these prosecutions. To put it mildly, it's been going on for a long time. This is the original stories that led to the investigations of Netanyahu were published, must be a decade ago by now. What is the status of Netanyahu? And
Yeah,
if he were to become prime minister, could he fix his situation?
Well, the cases have indeed been going on for a long time, not a decade, but he was under investigation for some time before the charge sheet was drawn up and the trial eventually got going. As I said, they're really complicated cases. This was a high stakes prosecution by the Attorney General, by the state prosecution, which Netanyahu charged from the start was basically an attempt to oust him by foul means, since he couldn't be ousted by fair means. And he's alleged that the police and the state prosecution, in league with the opposition and the media, have framed him. They are not open and shut cases. And indeed, it could be argued that he lost power in part because he was on trial and people may have switched support away from him. So very, very high stakes, could go on for a long time yet. In other words, there are hundreds of witnesses. There's very little cooperation. There's no cooperation. There's none of the normal, okay, we'll trade this witness and we won't call that one between prosecution and defense. No, it's incredibly acrimonious and it could go on for a long, long time. And there have been times when it has seemed as though Netanyahu might be interested in a plea bargain. That doesn't appear to be the case right now. And your follow-up question, what could Netanyahu do about it all if he came back to power, is a big factor here, because his critics believe that if he can muster the support and muster the votes, he will attempt to, quote unquote, reform the judicial system and basically find a way retroactively instituting legislation a la France, where the head of government cannot be prosecuted or put on trial in the course of their time in office. That it is alleged by his critics that he would seek to hobble the Supreme Court so that it could not intervene. They certainly want to reform, again, quote unquote, the process by which judges are chosen and who's making those decisions. So his critics, his opponents, including, as I stress, many from his ideological part of the spectrum, believe that part of the danger posed by Netanyahu is this rehabilitation, he would put it, reform, revolution, undermining, destruction, his critics would say, of the judicial system, in the process extricating himself from his legal difficulties.
David, there are several other things that I want to ask you about, but for now, just one last question, and we'll return in the discussion center. Do people anticipate this election to be just as close as the previous ones? That is, are we still thinking in terms of at best the low 60s as the majority that a government will have?
Yeah, that's exactly what people are anticipating. I would just be incredibly wary of any predicting or even assessing. When you have that many parties running, and you have more than a dozen parties with realistic aspirations, and about a dozen will probably get into parliament, when you have margin of error in opinion polls of around 4%, and when an error of much less than that in an assessment can cause a party to fall below the threshold and therefore lose 4 seats, or just clear the threshold and gain 4 seats, and therefore remake that 60-60 or 59-61 balance, you can't predict anything. I'll add just one more factor, which is Arab turnout. It is deemed, and I'm not sure this is entirely the case, by the way, but it is deemed very helpful for Netanyahu if Arab turnout is low, and very unhelpful for Netanyahu if Arab turnout is high. A single factor like that can remake the electoral balance, but most analysts believe it will be close.
David Horowitz of the Times of Israel, thanks. Stick with us. We'll come back to you for our discussion period. But first, we're going to hear from our second panelist, Aaron David Miller. Aaron David Miller is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His focus there is U.S. foreign policy, and he used to practice what he now studies. For nearly a quarter century, Miller advised presidents of both parties on Middle East affairs and took part in peace negotiations between Israel and its neighbors. He previously was vice president for new initiatives at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Aaron, it's always good to talk. Good to talk with you once again.
Robert, it's always good to see and hear you.
Thinking ahead to the next Israeli election in November, what do you think is at stake in that vote for Israel and for Israeli relations with the U.S.?
Before I do that, let me just identify 2 historical notes. Yesterday was the 29th anniversary of the signing of the Oslo Accords. I remember vividly sitting on the White House lawn on September 13th, 1993, thinking to myself that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was going to be resolved. History and reality proved to be very cruel teachers. I also, every time I see you these days, because of the Rabin Medical Center, my thoughts turn to the late Prime Minister of Israel. A life cut short, and it raises the fascinating counterfactual, to me at least, what would have happened had Rabin lived? Would you and I be having a different conversation today? I muse on it very often. Look, I'm not an Israeli. I don't play one on television, and I won't speak for the stakes for Israel. I'll leave that to David Horowitz, who's eminently qualified to do that. And I'd also say that, forgive me for not being overly excited and over enthusiastic that we're on the cusp of the 5th election in 3 years. There's a certain Groundhog Day quality to this election, to the Israeli political system, which is capable of change, although I would still call it predictable unpredictability, and its relations with the United States, which frankly, under Likud prime ministers, under Kadima prime ministers, under Labor prime ministers, under the government of change, has remained, despite all the ups and downs, remarkably constant. There are those who argue that we now should entertain the prospects of what I call the cosmic oive, that the U.S.-Israeli relationship, driven by generational changes, driven by fundamentally different views on the part of administrations toward key issues that are of central importance to Israel's prosperity and security. I'm not sure I ascribe to any of that. There is still a very important values and interests, confluence of interests here. I would only say that I think in Washington, there is a sense, and in the notion that we never intervene in Israeli politics and they don't intervene in ours, I think is an urban legend that should have long ago been retired. I would argue to you that we do have a stake in the outcome, that various administrations, even while they plead neutrality, are hardly neutral. I participated in 2 administrations, both of which interceded unsuccessfully. Arguably, one perhaps successly.
And interceded, how? Tell us what you mean when you say that.
Well, I'm thinking of two elections. One, clearly in 1992, when the late Yitzhak Rabin defeated Yitzhak Shamir. Then President H.W. Bush and former Secretary of State James Baker, for whom I worked, were very frustrated with Shamir's policies. Intriguing prime minister who managed to fall asleep at the Madrid conference and was quoted as basically saying that he hoped it would be decades before this process succeeded. But Bush and Baker were determined, I think, to make it unmistakably clear where they stood, and they denied Israel $10 billion of housing loan guarantees and outflanked Shamir and the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, in managing Congress. Those guarantees were given 3 months after Shamir was defeated in Kennebunkport. A commitment was made to Prime Minister Rabin. That was one example of clear interference. The second one was during the initial prime ministry of Benjamin Netanyahu, when he ran against Shimon Peres in the spring, June, I think elections were in June of 1996. Clinton, despite claiming neutrality, actually hosted Shimon Peres at the White House weeks before the election. That's would be almost unthinkable these days. One last point, but even the Biden administration, again professing neutrality, I think went to great lengths over the course of the last year to do nothing, absolutely nothing, that would upset the rather fragile balance of the change government under Naftali Bennett. They gave Bennett tremendous margin to maneuver with respect to settlement activity, moving the consulate to Jerusalem, and even on Ukraine, where, as you know, Prime Minister Bennett, while Prime Minister, you couldn't find a sentence which had Bennett, Putin, Ukraine, and condemn in close proximity to one another. So even that was a sort of intervention. I think on this one, though, I think we'll probably the administration will do its best to steer clear. But I think their expectations are probably under control with respect to what the outcome is going to be.
But we heard David Horowitz very delicately describe the difference, the division in Israel if we're dealing with the Palestinians. At this stage, can we honestly say the prospects for a two-state solution would be significantly greater if the election came out this way, which would, I guess, be the Lapid way, as opposed to that way, which would be the Bibi way?
I mean, I can't predict the future, but the headlines, let alone the trend lines. But I think the answer to your question is no. I don't care who wins this election. The prospects of a negotiated two-state solution where the 6 core issues that divide Israelis and Palestinians are adjudicated in some sort of conflict-ending solution: border security, refugees, Jerusalem, recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jews, and end of all conflict and claims. The notion that either Lapid, Benny Gantz, Benjamin Netanyahu, or anyone else in Israel, frankly, could lead its country into a negotiation with a divided and dysfunctional Palestinian national movement and huge gaps in mistrust and the absence of confidence on these 6 core issues, I think it's fantastical, Robert. Now, it may matter, in fact, with respect to how bad the situation becomes. But to your answer, is it going to bring us any closer to a two-state solution? I would say, count me a no on that one.
Okay, Aaron, and we'll come back and discuss further in just about 10 minutes after we hear from our third panelist, Rob Satloff. Rob Satloff is executive director of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he has been in that position for nearly 30 years. He has been studying and writing about the Middle East for a lot longer than that. His dissertation for his doctorate at St. Anthony's College, Oxford, was about the early years of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. In 2006, he wrote a book about Arabs in North Africa who saved lives of Jews during the Holocaust. It's called Among the Righteous. And he has written quite often for many publications about the Middle East, Israel, and U.S. policy in the region. Rob Satloff, good to see you. Welcome.
Hello. Good to see you too, Robert.
What's the short answer? What's at stake in the next Israeli election?
Well, there's quite a bit at stake for Israelis. I mean, things that maybe Americans don't follow very much, from the cost of living in Israel to education issues, all sorts of social issues, and then there are the issues that Americans do follow very closely. Issues of war and peace, relations with Arabs, relations with the broader world, relations with the United States. So there's quite an array of issues. Will they be resolved? Unlikely. If the past is prologue, chances that we'll see a 6th election are not insignificant. But you can't get to the 6th without going through the 5th. And so how this turns out will have big repercussions.
Setting aside Benjamin Netanyahu's legal problems and the scenario we put to David Horowitz before, if he were in office, would he, quote, reform the judicial system to his own benefit? Let's put that aside. Is being pro Netanyahu or being anti Netanyahu, is that what is it about? Is it about dealing with the Palestinians, dealing with Iran, dealing with America? What makes one pro or anti-Bibi?
It's actually a very interesting question, because there is, Netanyahu, the personality, and then there is, for lack of a better term, Bibiism that has developed around Netanyahu over certainly the last number of years. I mean, he's a very complex figure, a very interesting figure, historical figure, longest serving prime minister of Israel. He is, on one sense, it's accurate to say that Bibi Netanyahu is the most left-wing member of the Likud. He defines the left wing of the Likud. It's sort of mind-bending to put it this way, but what that underscores is just how far right the Likud has trended over the last number of years. And the Likud, which was for many years, the major right-wing party, is now very much in the center of Israeli politics. And there are significant parties that could register in double digits in Israel's parliamentary system, namely getting 10% or more of the vote, that are much, much further to the right, much more draconian in their views of relations with Arabs, Palestinians, and Arabs more broadly. Bibi has helped that process.
Mm-hmm.
He has negotiated agreements among further right-wing leaders much further to the right to him. He's negotiated unity agreements so that not a single vote gets lost in Israel's arcane system where every vote can matter.
Yes.
And so he's tried to keep every possible right-wing vote within the accepted voting system. And so even if he is the left wing of his party, he is appealing to the furthest right that Israel can produce.
I just want to clarify for people who don't quite follow this, what it means not to waste any votes or lose any votes. You have to get 3.25% of the electorate to get a seat in the Knesset. So just to imagine a crazy hypothetical, if there were five left-wing pro-settler parties. This is very hypothetical.
Right-wing,
yes. And no, well, I'm being completely speculative here, and they all poll an even 3% of the vote.
Right.
They get 0 seats.
Right. So to put it in numerical terms, if you need 120,000 votes to pass the threshold, and you only get 110,000, all 110,000 disappear.
So if you can bring together 4 parties, each of which would poll 110,000, you could have 5 seats in the Knesset or something like that.
You'll have even many more than that. Yes.
Because so part of what's going on right now in Israel is the forging of new party alliances.
And Netanyahu is a master at this. So he succeeded in the last several days in building a huge coalition of the far, far, far right. I mean, the people, some leaders whose language, personality, terms, policies would be very far from any mainstream discussion that would happen between an American and an Israeli leader. And yet Netanyahu himself doesn't subscribe to those views. He just knows that for them to get any chance to have any role in government, they need him to be their standard bearer, and he needs their votes to get over 61, the majority of a 120-seat Knesset.
I'm curious, Rob, is it your sense that the involvement of an Arab party actually in a governing coalition was a major Israeli development? Did it have any regional resonance at all? Did people take note in neighboring Jordan, for example, and say, well, that's, things could be getting better over there? What would you say?
Look, it's difficult to say in the short term. I think it was a huge event that a gentleman by the name of Mansour Abbas, this is different than Mahmoud Abbas, who was the leader of the Palestinian Authority. This is Mansour Abbas, an Israeli Arab, leader of party called Ra'am, with 4 seats, through his support to the governing coalition, and did it because he wants to be. He says, "I'm Israeli. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm Arab. Yes, I'm Palestinian, but I am Israeli, and I want to be a full party. I want to be a full citizen. My people want their full share of the public pie. We don't agree on everything, but let's work on what we agree on." I think this had resonance far beyond Israel. I think that there are Arab voters in countries that, whose governments are far short of democracies, who look at this and say, my gosh, even in Israel, Arab voters are not just being solicited, but they are kingmakers. They can make or break governments. Wow, that's pretty impressive.
as opposed to actually having a king say, whom you might not actually be able to
Yes.
influence. So, Rob Satloff, thanks. Stay with us. I want to bring back David Horowitz and Aaron David Miller and start. Rob Satloff was just alluding to some pretty far right-wing parties that Netanyahu has helped to unify into a bloc. David Horowitz, you wrote recently about one of the figures who's part of that alliance. It's Itamar Ben-Gvir of the group called Otzma Yehudit, which I guess is Israeli Strength. Tell us a bit about Ben-Gvir.
Yeah, Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Strength. I'll pick up on what Rob was saying. Netanyahu has united, not in his Likud, but in his bloc, a group of parties, including Ben-Gvir's Otzma Yehudit, a very virulently anti-LGBTQ party who he forced into this merger today, and the sort of parent party of that far-right bloc, which is called Religious Zionism. So Ben-Gvir is a disciple of Meir Kahane, who was banned from the Knesset and whose Kach party was banned for being racist. Ben-Gvir is only able to, he's a serving member of parliament, he's only able to run because he's reined in his previous positions, calling for the expulsion of Arabs, and now he only wants to expel disloyal Arabs, an assessment that I assume he would make.
This is somebody who once had a photo of Baruch Goldstein, the guy who killed people in the cave of the patriarchs on the West Bank. He once had in his office, I gather, a picture of him, which he's
in his home until quite recently, when it began to look like it might become problematic for him, possibly legally. I want to elaborate. I want to expand my answer. I'll do it briefly to the question that you asked Rob about what's at stake, and all the things that Rob said are spot on. But I would say that elements of our democracy are at stake in this election, and especially the independence of our judicial system. Because if Netanyahu has the votes and people like Itamar Ben-Gvir will be at his side in this, they will try to remake that balance and basically to create a situation in which the political majority fully controls basically everything in Israel without any breaks, and certainly without the kind of very, very sensitive balance of authority that currently exists between the elected politicians and the judicial system. So there's all the Palestinian issues and Iran, and boy, are those important. And we can talk about them if you like, but very, very much at stake now, that balance. And Mr. Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who heads this list of the far right, they're heading for 11, 12, 13 seats. They're very popular among younger Israelis on the right of the political spectrum. Ben-Gvir is a real charismatic, energetic, dangerous provocateur in my assessment. I don't think the polls are going to be wildly wrong. I don't think they're wildly overestimating the support. And Rob, you're so right that Netanyahu, in terms of his stated political positions, is relatively on the left of the Likud. But I don't think we can allow him to get away with that when he's welded together this bloc with whom he will possibly need to be allied if he wants to come back as prime minister, because he's mainstreamed extremist politicians here. And therefore, whatever he may say in terms of his political orientation, and by the way, even maybe do, it's quite possible, depending on the results, that he will turn to someone like Benny Gantz, a centrist politician, and say, listen, I've got enough votes to be prime minister with those far right people, but you don't want that to happen, and I don't really want that to happen. So save me from having to put Ben-Gvir in my coalition by partnering with me. But it will be he who has created that, what would then be an incredibly difficult dilemma for somebody like Benny Gantz.
I'd like to put to the three of you some of the questions that we've received from people who've been listening. And first, I'll ask Aaron about this. Rabin Gottlieb asks, do you think things might be better if Israel's Knesset were bicameral, like the U.S. or even England, where the House of
Right.
Lords has some say in matters?
I mean, it's a great question, but it's a so far counterfactual. David could comment extensively, I'm sure, on changes in the Israeli political system when they went to the direct election of the prime minister, which was a substantial change. I would just, I refer everything through an American filter these days. That's really where my focus is. The Constitution of the United States was amended 27 times in 240 plus years, and the first 10 amendments came as a group. I don't see, despite all of the talk about abolishing the Electoral College and any of the other fundamental reforms that would restructure our political system, I just don't see any of that happening in what I consider to be, let's put it this way, Aaron David Miller time. That is to say, the extent over the next 15 or 20 years, let's say, okay? And I don't see those sorts of major changes happening in Israel. Israel has no formal constitution. They have a series of basic laws. They were wise not to have a constitutional debate because they were fighting for their very survival during the inception of their state. Had they had a debate over what Israel is, what kind of state it is, where it is supposed to be, I think it would be an encumbrance. But now you look back and you realize, and David is 100% right, right in this sense, that there are, and I'm not criticizing because I look at the fate of our republic. On June 13th, there was a peaceful transition of power, from Benjamin Netanyahu to Yair Lapid. I wish I could say the same thing.
I mean, from
in Israel on June 13th, 2021, from Netanyahu to Lapid. I wish I could say the same thing when it comes to our republic, or have the kind of confidence that, in fact, we're not due for another very difficult situation over the next several years. So the answer to the question is yes, electoral reform or fundamental reform might help, but it's simply not going to happen.
Did either of you, either Rob or David, want to comment further on this admittedly speculative proposal? No. Here's a question from Sam Hillard. I'd like your opinion on the following. If Bibi would not run, the question just disappeared as I was asking, but the question was, if Bibi would not run, would Likud, and more broadly, would the right, easily win a majority election in the parliament? David, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. It would be the situation would be very different. I think Likud would have won several of the recent elections. By the way, Aaron, I just want to, the transition was from Netanyahu to Bennett, obviously, and then Lapid took over. Yes, there were some little challenges to Netanyahu within Likud. Yuli Edelstein, former Speaker of the Knesset, was going to run against Netanyahu because he kept saying, you're not going to win this election. You keep nearly winning elections, but not quite getting there. And if I was leading the party, basically almost anybody was leading the party who isn't you, we'd be in power. But Edelstein was talked out of running. Gideon Saar, the aforementioned former cabinet secretary and minister, a member of the outgoing coalition, utterly devoted to ensuring Netanyahu not return to power, had challenged Netanyahu within Likud and has argued that it is in fact Netanyahu who is keeping the ideological right from power. And if only he would go, all the causes that he purports to champion above all others would be advanced. And therefore, one must mistrust Netanyahu's credibility. It's really all about Netanyahu. That's the Saar argument. So the short answer to the question, the Israeli right would be in power. It would be a uniformly right and ultra-Orthodox coalition, were it not for Netanyahu. If the leader of the Likud chose to build that kind of coalition, the Likud would be running Israel straightforwardly, and we would not have had several of these elections.
And Robert?
Yes.
So the complementary comment to this is what happens to Netanyahu if yet again he does not succeed to form his own government? There is a point, one has to assume that there's a point at which some point where Likudniks say, well, how many times can you try and still fail? My hunch, and it's only a hunch, and I'd be interested in my colleagues' hunch, is that this is it. Is that that it's difficult to imagine another time that they will let him And I can easily put together scenarios where pieces of the potential Netanyahu coalition break away and say, we've given you 3, 4, 5 times, it's time to move on.
I want to run past David Horowitz, what Rob said earlier about the significance of an Arab party being part of an Israeli government. Was that a one-shot deal in which there would be a government based only on being anti-Bibi Netanyahu, or has Israeli politics moved to a new phase where Arab parties are real players and they will take part in the hurly-burly of making coalitions?
It's a really good question. These are hard to give definitive answers to, even if the answer seems obvious. Okay, so Ram was in the outgoing coalition. Rob highlighted Mansour Abbas. Mansour Abbas is a remarkable politician, somebody who has said to Israel's Arab citizens, guys, this is a Jewish state. That's the way it's going to be. Get over it. It's not going to change. And we can all either be in eternal opposition or we can try and partner with the Jewish majority for our own interests within this country. That's extraordinary things to say. Now, he is not universally believed. Netanyahu, who would have loved to have built a coalition with Ram if that would have been possible to achieve power, because he was unable to do that, now castigates Ram and the other main Arab party, which is much less ready to be legislating in harmony with the Zionist majority, shall we say, something called the Joint List. But Ram, it's really something. And if Netanyahu, after these elections, can find a way to a coalition, and the only way to that coalition is with Ram, the party that he castigates, he would do it. And by the way, many of his supporters, not all of them, and we're really into the minutiae because some on the far right prevented him from trying to do that in the past, but he would partner with Ram. So it's not that the Israeli electorate, in its Jewish mainstream, suddenly decided, hey, let's make an Arab party part of sort of the business of government here. It was a function of would-be coalition leaders' desperation and the emergence of a party that could be considered kosher, right? To use a word that Ram wouldn't. I think it's been, quite something for Israel to have had Ram in government. But it was desperation rather than some kind of new maturity. And I don't know where it goes from here. I'm not even sure how well Ram does in the next elections. And I said something a bit ambivalent before. I'm not sure if Ram clears the threshold and is a potential kingmaker again, that we should automatically assume that they wouldn't sit with Netanyahu. So even the things that we think we can assume, I would be wary about assuming them.
Aaron, do you any thoughts on the significance of Ram's participation?
Yeah, I think it's extraordinary that the participation of Mansour Abbas, a dentist from northern Israel, became the first independent Arab party in the history of the state, weeks after the worst communal violence between Israeli Arabs and Jews since the pre-state period. It's remarkable. Again, I'm not a glass half full or half empty guy these days. I'm a glass filling guy. I mean, it was a potentially positive development, which I think augurs well. But I think that David's points are well taken. And it's way too early, it seems to me, to predict what the Knesset arithmetic is going to look like on the night or the morning of November 2nd.
Since we've been talking a lot about Benjamin Netanyahu, and these elections have been largely about whether or not he is to be the prime minister of Israel, and as David Horowitz, as you've said, there could be any number of different configurations of parties that he would be okay with if you could make a majority out of them. I'd like to hear about Netanyahu from the three of you. That is, how he's the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. He's eclipsed Ben Gurion in terms of longevity in office. How do you assess him? And we'll start with Rob Satloff. I mean, how shrewd politician, coalition maker? What else has he been? Has he been good for Israel during his time? What do you say about him?
Well, we historians, the first answer we'll say is, ask me in 20 or 30 or 50 years. He certainly had enormous impact on Israel, especially, I would say, in a number of arenas. One, we tend to overlook in economics, in finance, in accentuating the entrepreneurial, the startup nation personality of Israel today. Secondly, in terms of Israel's standing in the broader world, he opened up political and diplomatic markets the way one would open up economic markets, and in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, a huge effort to expand Israel's diplomatic presence. To his credit, subterranean efforts throughout the Middle East, in the Arab world, also that eventually reaped dividends. Not that he was the key variable in the Abraham Accords. That, in my view, was the ruler of the United Arab Emirates. In fact, one of the rationales for the Emirates to make this deal was to stop Netanyahu from doing something that they thought was very dangerous, namely the annexation of territory in the West Bank. But what Bibi had done in the years previous to this was build important foundations in many Arab countries through private diplomacy. That was very important for the state of Israel. On the Iran file, I think it's a very gray answer. Certainly a lot of tough talk, certainly a major effort to stop the Obama administration from achieving a nuclear deal that was unsuccessful in the end, although successful to get Donald Trump to change tack. In the end, it wasn't Israeli efforts it's undetermined whether the Israeli effort to slow down the Iranian nuclear program will be successful. So this one is a gray answer. So there's some very important achievements, some very difficult problems, as David underscored, about Israeli democracy on his watch, especially exacerbated over the last 2 or 3 or 4 years of his prime ministry. And so I think, it's going to take some time before history is quite clear on its verdict of Netanyahu as leader of the state of Israel.
Aaron David Miller?
There are those who love him and those who despise him. I feel somewhat, and I've made my views on this clear in a sort of balanced way, at least to analyze him. I think he's a prime minister who is incredibly risk averse. I think there are words and there are deeds. And there's an effort sometimes to conflate them. I think on security matters, he has proven himself to be extraordinarily risk averse. Whether it comes to taking care of the problem of Hamas in Gaza, pressed by his right wing, whether it comes to Lebanon, and even on Iran, perhaps in a brief period where the Israelis were seriously contemplating a military strike. I think he is concerned about military action, obviously, because it involves the loss of Israeli lives, but it also threatens, it seems to me, his own political aspirations, which brings me to the second point, a point that Anshel Pfeffer has made repeatedly. He wants this.
Anshel Pfeffer, we should say, writing in Horowitz.
He wants to be prime minister. He wants to be a great leader. More than any other single politician that is operating in Israel today. He desires it more. He craves it more. And let's separate out the indictment for a minute. And he's prepared to do things and make deals, I think, that other Israeli politicians are not prepared to make, simply because of his desire, which makes him unbelievably formidable. Final point, here my bias is showing. I think as a populist, whether he's influenced by others that with whom he has commented and dealt favorably, people like Viktor Orban or our previous president, he may fashion himself a uniter, but I think he really is a divider. And as a populist, what is a populist? It's a man or woman who, number one, plays on cultural backlash and delves in cultural issues in an effort to separate his tribe, his group from the others. And number two, a populist is someone who pushes the mainstream, pushes back on the system. And I would argue to you that he basically checks both boxes. Mm-hmm. And I think now, at this moment in Israel's history, I mentioned Rabin before. I think what is required is not Benjamin Netanyahu's brand of leadership with respect to healing the divisions or managing the divisions that currently affect the state of Israel.
And David Horowitz, you have what I guess will be the last word, and it's your appraisal of your country's prime minister.
Yeah, well, Robert, we're 53 minutes into this conversation. You just called him the prime minister. He's not the prime minister.
Yes.
No, but that's the point, right? We've barely talked about anybody else. Our prime minister's name is Yair Lapid. Yep. I think we've mentioned him twice. Bennett was in power for most of the last year. He's a giant among pygmies. At least that's how he would put it, I think. He, like almost all Israeli prime ministers, maybe Shamir was an exception, came to believe that the survival of the state, or at the very least the well-being, but I think for most of them, the very survival of the state depended on them being prime minister. I think you can say that about almost all of Israel's, certainly recent, but maybe almost all of Israel's prime minister. Your point of the points that other people have made about his, your point, Aaron, the will. This guy's in his early 70s. Benny Gantz had entered politics. I've lost track. 4 elections ago. Gantz is pictured in his car coming home at the end of election day, looking totally exhausted. A couple of hours before the polls are going to close, Netanyahu's in his suit with his trousers, his pants rolled up, with a megaphone on the beach, calling out to people in the water, have you voted? There's still time to come and vote, right? This is an indefatigable politician. Rob, you think he might be finished if he doesn't win this time? I don't know the answer to that. But he said just the other day, he was asked, you're gonna quit if you don't win this time? He said, I'm carrying on until the right returns to power. So that will, that indomitability. And then, of course, many of the things that we've mentioned, I won't reiterate too many of them, but the economic thing is a really big deal, driving Israeli tech forward, realizing the opportunity there, so smart, so quickly in terms of realizing what COVID might turn out to be, very, very sharp, incredibly well-read, and terribly divisive, and so insightful with a C against his political opponents, so delegitimating of his political opponents. Anyone who's not with him ideologically or even practically, is dangerous to the state. That's why you've got so many of his former allies from the same part of the spectrum, who obviously that some of them, and in fact all of them, have their own interests at stake in their political orientation, but with a degree of credibility, at least for some of them, that says, no, this is not the Netanyahu of years ago. This is someone whose own interests are now potentially skewing the interests of the state if he remains or returns to power. Many of the people who've worked closest with him have come to regard him as a danger. And that says something.
Well, David Horowitz, Aaron David Miller, and Rob Satloff, thanks to all three of you for taking part today in our panel. Many thanks as well to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, Roni Giuliano, and Adrian Kiss from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections, and also our technical director, Stefan Ben Said. Our program sponsor is the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. It's a 501c3 national charitable organization. It represents, in the United States, Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv. The group's website is www.afrmc.org. Join us next month for Cancer Therapies, Medicines of the Present and Future, with special guest Dr. Susan Domchek, Executive Director of the Bassar Center for BRCA at the University of Pennsylvania, and other expert guests. I'm Robert Siegel. This has been Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.